We also know that this was sort of a rough area. This part of town, again, not really where she lived. She was sort of familiar with it because Eddie actually lived nearby. So she had been around this before, but it was not her neighborhood. And it just was not the kind of place that you would want to be walking alone at night, probably especially as a smaller woman.
Hi, everybody. Welcome back to True Crime Unsolved. I'm Miles Reef. I'm here as always with my buddy Sean Cahill. This is the place where we tackle the stories that the TV networks won't touch. Unsolved homicides, missing persons cases, stories without an ending. Sean, what are we getting into today?
Hey, Miles. So today we are getting into a brand new case. This is an interesting one, and I actually haven't seen too much coverage of it. I know it's appeared on a podcast, and I think one television show covered it. But other than that, this is a classic example of something that I think needs more attention, which is, of course, where we're happy to step into the breach, right? So we're going to talk today about the disappearance of Kirsten Brueggeman, who's a 26-year-old woman who disappeared after a night out socializing with some people that she knew in Indianapolis back in 2021. It's a very odd story. It's one of these where someone is with a bunch of people and a couple minutes later, it's like they vanished into thin air. Her family is beside themselves trying to figure out what happened here. And as we look at the details of the night, I think there are some directions that it kind of points, and I'm curious to see what our viewers think when we get there. So, before we dive into the details of the disappearance itself, Miles, maybe you can give us a little bit about Kirsten's background.
Absolutely. So, as Sean mentioned, time of her disappearance, Kirsten was 26 years old. She had grown up and was living in Lawrence, Indiana. That's a small city. It's got a population of about 50,000 people. It's in northeast of Indianapolis. I guess you could call it a suburb. Officially, I do believe that it is a city. Kirsten was actually living with her parents at the time of her disappearance. She was working in a restaurant on the south side of the city. According to her folks and to other people that we've spoken to, she was someone who had always loved animals. She was a big reader. She was intelligent. She had a great sense of humor. Her parents did describe her to us as kind of strong-willed and very independent. I think this matters, and this isn't obviously to disparage her in any way, but from speaking to her folks and from doing our own research, it has become apparent that Kirsten did have some mental health struggles in her life, that she had struggled with her own mental health. She had also had some issues with drinking and maybe smoked a little marijuana. We don't really know if things went any further than that, but she definitely, had some drinking and partying in her history. She also had a sort of history of volatile personal relationships. And she did have a particular relationship with an ex named Eddie Bradford that had been a kind of on and off again thing for quite some time. I do bring that up in particular because it will come up later in this case. There's one last thing that I want to mention. And again, we're just laying out the facts here. This in no way is an indictment of Kirsten or her reputation, but I do think we have to mention that at the time of her disappearance, Kirsten was on probation. So she had had a previous charge and she had been let out and she was on probation. But obviously, she was working, she was living with her folks, she was living a life. Sean, why don't you take us to the night of her disappearance and kind of set the table for us on that?
Yeah, let's talk about it. So I think one of the interesting things here that her family made clear to us that's easy to forget is that this took place the night of January 1st, 2021 into the early hours of January 2nd. And if you remember 2021, that was kind of like prime time COVID, right? So the way her parents broke it down for us was that not only was Kirsten on house arrest, but the world was kind of on lockdown in a lot of places and in a lot of ways. And so she was spending an inordinate amount of time at home with her parents and did not really, like the rest of us, go out and do a lot outside of her work. And what she did for a living at that point in time was she worked at a pizza place. And so on the night that she disappeared, she was on shift at that pizza place, and she left her mother's house where she was living earlier in the afternoon. And normally her mom would pick her up after work and they would come home because, like I said, people just weren't doing much at that point in time, as most of us remember. But on that night, Kirsten told her mom, no, actually, after I get off work, I'm going to try to meet up with some people and do a little bit of socializing, and I will find my own way home. Don't worry about it. And this wasn't atypical. I mean, once in a while, Kirsten would do stuff and take an Uber home. She was very familiar with Ubering around town. She did not have her own car. So her mom said, okay, fine. That's totally all right. You know, she's 26 years old. She's an adult, not much to worry about. So Kirsten does work at her pizza job and she gets off shift around 10 p.m. After that, she goes to a nearby bar called Manly's Irish Mutt and she does take an Uber there. The people she meets there are her ex-boyfriend, Eddie Bradford, who we talked about in the introduction, as well as some of his friends. Now, it's interesting to note, from what we're told, most of the people that were there that night with Eddie were not really um, Kirsten's friends, or she might have been acquainted with them, but they were not like close personal friends. They're people that she sort of knew through him. And so what happens next is kind of interesting when you look at it through that lens. Kirsten becomes pretty intoxicated. Eddie actually later said she showed up to that bar with a backpack that had a six pack in it. So she kind of came to party, it would seem. And party she does. Everybody's having fun. But then Kirsten becomes sort of like difficult, right? The what's said later is that she was just a little out of control and kind of drunker than everybody else. She actually vomits in the bar and kind of draws attention to the group, at which point the bar's managers ask them all to leave. This goes out into the parking lot. Kirsten, her ex-boyfriend, and his friends, it becomes a sort of an argument, a verbal altercation. She's drunk and angry, and these people actually want to keep hanging out. So what winds up happening is they're going to go to a bowling alley, but because of this argument, Kirsten winds up not going. She actually punches one of the friends' cars as they're leaving, and it becomes this kind of like really ugly scene that results in them leaving Kirsten alone in this parking lot. It's important to remember Kirsten did not live in this part of town. This was after midnight. It was about 12:15, I think, when they finally left her there. And so this is the moment that I think everything really changes for Kirsten, and a series of events are kicked into motion that we still don't really have all the answers for. So, Miles, why don't you take it from here?
So absolutely. So as Sean said, the group heads off. It's about 12:15 when they leave, and Kirsten is then by herself in that parking lot. Now, what she does is she heads off by herself on foot. What we do know is that she headed towards the direction of where there's a YMCA in the city. We can put that up. You guys could, we could put up a little map so you guys can kind of see the route that she took. Now, about 15 minutes later, give or take, her phone dies. Now, this is like 12:30 a.m. It's a bit of a mystery here because we don't know of any catastrophic event. There was no weather stuff going on, and she is seen later. So, I'm going to get to that, but there is evidence of Kirsten still being walking around and, existing because she literally vanishes into thin air after this 12:30 phone dying incident. So, I don't know. Did her phone die? Did she just not have a charge? But there's no pings. There's no digital contact. There's no text. There's no phone calls. There's nothing. 12:30, her phone shut off, and there's no more contact with her. So from here on out, Kirsten is essentially invisible to the rest of the world. So Kirsten never came home that night. Her mother tried calling her over and over again, but the phone continued going to voicemail. So the parents do not call the police until the following morning. So that would be Sunday morning. Kirsten goes missing, early hours of Sunday morning, Saturday night leading into Sunday morning. And then they call the cops Sunday. The police actually start investigating her disappearance on Monday. Okay. So they get into it pretty hard and they immediately find some surveillance footage. So they actually find footage of Kirsten walking near the YMCA and through sort of like the alleyways in an apartment complex that is nearby the YMCA. She kind of appears disoriented. She's kind of wandering back and forth. She doesn't seem to have any direction. She seems, like she's not really going anywhere specific. Now, as I said earlier, her phone dies at 12:30, but her last confirmed sighting is actually at 2 a.m. So what's interesting is in this footage, you can see that Kirsten's walking. It's 2 a.m. and then there's a camera glitch. And then the video resumes at 2:30 and Kirsten's gone. Now, not to say that she should be standing there for half an hour, but that is the last time that anyone sees Kirsten is in this footage, which then glitches and then there's never another sight of her after that.
It's very unusual and it is very spooky. What you're describing almost sounds like a horror movie, right? Where we've got glimpses of somebody in the night all alone, cameras dying and then coming back on, people disappearing. So the detectives were obviously very intrigued by this footage. And what we still don't know is what exactly she was doing, right? It's hard for anybody who takes a look at this, including Kirsten's family, to ascertain what the purpose of this sort of like midnight walking back and forth was. It's been postulated that maybe she was continuing to drink. Like we said earlier, Eddie had said she brought a backpack with beer in it to the bar. She was already angry and intoxicated when she left. It's not inconceivable that somebody in that state of mind with sort of known substance abuse issues might continue to, drink or maybe even seek out other substances. Um, so here's what we do know, right? Maybe it's easier to just talk about that first, and then we can continue to explore the unknown. So, like I said, she was intoxicated. That's a fact. Multiple witnesses, and including the bar that kicked her out, attest to that. We know that she was separated from the group. Again, that's from witnesses. She refused any sort of help home, right? People offered to call her a ride. No, she didn't want it. She was angry. She left, and she did not summon an Uber at that point. So this altercation happens at 12:15, where the friends drive off. Her phone dies at 12:30. Whether she turned it off herself, we don't know. But even if it was a battery issue, she had 15 minutes to call a ride home. And for some reason, she did not choose to do that. We don't know why. And then we also know that this was sort of a rough area. This part of town, again, not really where she lived. She was sort of familiar with it because Eddie actually lived nearby. So she had been around this before, but it was not her neighborhood. And it just was not the kind of place that you would want to be walking alone at night, probably especially as a smaller woman who's intoxicated and very vulnerable. Let's just call it out. She was not in a great place to be protecting herself at night with nobody around if somebody wanted to do something to her. Um, so the other thing we know, right, is everything Miles just told us about the security cameras, and the last time she was seen was basically roughly between 2 and 2:30. That's the last accounting for her that we have, and after that, there is no more from Kirsten that anyone has ever found. So what we don't know is why this happened, right? It's been reported that near where she was seen, and actually she was moving towards this building, was an apartment building that had a hole in a fence that for some reason was sort of like this notorious ripped fence that was later repaired. And people are sort of in disagreement about whether that hole existed the night that Kirsten was walking around that area. But if she was walking towards that, and she actually went through it for some reason. The building behind it is an apartment building that is known to be very rough. Murders have occurred there. Drug dealers are said to have lived there. At the time that this happened, not the specific minutes of that night, but around that week, the police were actually surveilling a bank robbery suspect who lived in that apartment building. So that gives you sort of a feel for like what this area was like, and also specifically the kind of people that were around right where she was. And it also begs the question, did she know someone in that building? Is that why she was sort of heading in that direction? Maybe she was going to buy drugs or meet with somebody. Her parents admitted to us, and you'll see in their interview next week, they really didn't know who Kristen knew. She was very private about that part of her life, and they expressly said they were not too happy about a lot of the people they were aware of that she chose to acquaint herself with, which then sort of begs the question, well, if they're not happy about the ones they know about, how bad could the ones that they don't know about be, right? So that's just some background texture to this. We don't know for sure that that's what happens, but we do know that she disappeared, and all of these facts are relevant, right, Miles? Why don't you take it from here? I feel like there's more.
I think the best thing to do now is break down the possibilities here. For us, there's three main possibilities of what happened to Kirsten and what happened that night. First is that perhaps she disappeared voluntarily. Now, this has to be addressed because I think any time that someone just, sort of disappears into thin air, it has to be talked about. And you guys know we've mentioned this possibility in multiple cases that we've covered on this channel. And the first thing to do is look at, is there any reason that she would have wanted to do that, right? So here you have a person who had a history of struggles with mental health. She obviously, she was on probation. She was dealing with her own legal problems. And she had personal struggles as well. Obviously she had this volatile relationship with her ex, Eddie. She was still hanging out with him sometimes. She was living with her parents at this age. Definitely probably not in exactly the place she wanted to be in her life. So the idea that, like, someone might just want to walk away from that, you know, You could make that argument, right? But the problem is that there's been no movement of money. There's been no contact to anybody. There's no digital footprint of her, and there's been no sightings. And usually with these cases, if someone does, go somewhere else, there's at least some hint of it, something happens, and there's basically been nothing. I mean, it's just complete silence in every way from Kirsten since the day that she disappeared. So it does seem to me that this is extremely unlikely that she went off on her own. Also, as we all know, and you guys know, we've discussed this in some other cases, disappearing off the grid, it's not like the movies, it's actually very, very hard. It's hard to set yourself up in a new life, especially if you don't have resources and you don't have a personal network or anything like that. Just deciding to like, hey, I'm just going to go over here and I'm going to start over. It's not necessarily as easy as people think it is. It can be done, but I do think that that's highly unlikely. So I think the second theory that we should discuss is that somebody that Kirsten knew actually harmed her. Now, why I bring this up is that, obviously, most of the time when there is violence, when something does happen to a person, it's someone that they know. That's just the facts. Usually it's a personal relationship, family relationship. It's the people that we're involved with that have a reason to have something against us. That where there's passion involved, where there's history. That's usually what happens. So, look, we do know that there was arguments that night. We do know that Kirsten was acting out. We do know that she was perhaps upsetting the situation for the people who were there. We do know that there was a history of sort of emotional instability between her and herself and other people as well. Um, and I think the most obvious thing here is we have to say it. I mean, her on again, off again boyfriend was present that night, right? And she obviously didn't make his night easy. Everything that happened in the bar, everything that happened afterwards. I mean, to the point where they left her alone and abandoned her in that parking lot, and left her to her own devices. That takes a lot, right? So there may have been reason to be angry at her. Now, I'm not saying that that was enough reason to disappear her, which what seems to be what happened, but I think we do have to talk about it. Now, the problem with this is that, again, her phone doesn't show any contact with anybody else. The group has had multiple alibis verified that everybody who left there, where they went next, it's been confirmed that they were there. And also the police have said that everyone's been extremely cooperative, including Eddie, and that everyone has voluntarily done interviews. Their stories match up, and basically, as far as what we can tell from the investigators, they've been cleared. Now, as you guys know, sometimes the cops say that because they're waiting for something else to happen. They're waiting for the other shoe to drop. Who knows? But as far as we know right now, everybody that was with her that night has been cleared. Their alibis have withstood scrutiny. There's no evidence that's tying anyone who was there that night to Kirsten's disappearance, as far as we know. Now, the third sort of option on the theories here is probably the most likely from my perspective, which is that there was an opportunistic predator who came along and Kirsten was in the wrong place at the wrong time. Now, she was alone. She was clearly intoxicated. Looking at the footage, it seems like she was disoriented. This wasn't the best area. And I'm sure that people are going to drop in the comments and tell us that, we're wrong about that and whatever. But, going in and out of these alleyways around this apartment complex wasn't necessarily the best place to be for her, right? So, I think that someone probably could have seen her, recognized an opportunity here, and decided to, do something that, perhaps wasn't meant to be permanent, but led to a bad situation, which then led to Kirsten being gone. I say this also with sort of knowledge of having interviewed Kirsten's parents already, because as you guys know, Sean and I usually do the interviews first and want to get as much information as we can before we shoot these case breakdown videos, so we have a little personal insight. And from speaking to her parents, it's clear that she was a fighter. That if anything had happened to her, say if someone had tried to assault her in any way, she probably would have fought back and probably escalated the situation to a point where perhaps, it would have gone in a very, very bad direction. The other thing to remember is that even though she had that fighting spirit, Kirsten, as Sean has mentioned, was very petite. This is a very petite girl, and probably a perfect candidate for some sort of predator who could have come across her that night. So I don't know what you think, Sean, but to me, this does seem like an extremely likely scenario.
Yeah, I would have to say so. I think anybody that looks at this case kind of looks there first, right? I mean, especially knowing that everyone else has cooperated and there's her alone on camera. This isn't a he said, she said. These people really did leave and go have a night to themselves that's corroborated. And Kirsten is very obviously on camera, drunk, disoriented, and in a place that she shouldn't be. So I hate to say it, but this is the kind of situation that is sort of I don't want to use the word cliche, but it almost is. Woman drunk and disoriented at night in a place where she's unfamiliar is what they tell you not to do. And that's for a good reason, because people with bad intentions see a person like that who's small, intoxicated, and doesn't really know where they are and has no one around to help them as prey, and that may have happened here. We don't know for sure yet, but it certainly seems very likely. And the thing is, and we heard this from her family, like you said, Kirsten being a fighter, Kirsten sort of having this personality that just was like take no BS from anybody and sort of like a tough customer, Even her dad came like right out of the gate in his interview and sort of described her in words, more or less like that. Like she could be a tough customer. And so it's not hard to imagine that somebody may have said something to her and she responded in a way that lit them off, and it ended really poorly. Or it could be that somebody tricked her because they realized she was in need of help and intoxicated and presented themselves as somebody who could give her a ride, or you can come in and get warm, or hey, you want some drugs, whatever it might have been that she felt like she needed at that point, and then pulled the wool over her eyes and did something horrible. I feel like the answer may lie somewhere in that direction because, like you said, her disappearing makes no sense. Her family said that she had her troubles, but she wasn't unhappy necessarily to the degree that she would take off and start a new life. She also didn't have the resources to do it. I mean, again, we're talking about a 26-year-old woman who lives with her parents, is on house arrest, and works at a pizza place. This is not exactly the type of individual who gets on a private jet and disappears to an island somewhere, never to be seen again, right? And it may be because, it's not a mystery of who she knew. It's more of a mystery of who saw her that they're having trouble figuring it out because when the sad truth of the fact is when a stranger does something to somebody, it can be a lot harder to figure out because the detectives love to go to everyone in your life, to your job, to your bank account, all the things that are connected to you for clues. And when none of those things yield any clues and it really is like a bolt from the blue, some person with zero connection to you has taken you and put you somewhere. Where do you begin with that? Unless a camera caught it or the phone is pinging and we know the phone was dead, it's a pretty tough trail to follow. So I'm curious to hear what our viewers think about that, but I am leaning a little bit in that direction myself after looking at all the facts.
I think that's right. I think there's two ways that this could have gone. And, one involves people that perhaps were there that night that had a history with her, and the other is this random predator. I do think it's really important that we hit on this, is that this is another case of a young person having been out drinking, becoming intoxicated, and then being left alone by the people that she was with that night. Now, I think this is a little different than some of the other cases that we've seen because obviously, by all accounts, Kirsten was being very aggressive. She was fighting with the people that she was with. Perhaps it was impossible to put up with her. But still, you have to kind of look at that and say, young people abandoning each other and not thinking about the long-term consequences of what might happen, is something that really, really needs to be addressed. And I think people need to be educated on that because, as you said earlier, Sean, like that was the moment when everything changed for her. That was kind of like, okay, she was on her own. She was in this extremely vulnerable position, and then she probably ended up in the wrong place, and the wrong person came across her. And if she hadn't been left alone, if one person had stayed behind and walked with her, if one person had stayed behind and like made sure she got into a cab, tried to sober her up, took her to a 7-Eleven, gotten a cup of coffee, any of those things, this might have gone completely different and she would still be with us. We would not be making this video about her right now.
Yeah. And that extends, to everyone involved. I mean, a lot of times, like you hear about a bar will call somebody a cab if they're worried about them. I don't know if that was offered in this case. It may have. I don't want to like impugn those people, but that's an example of how, everybody is everybody's responsibility in a way when you're out in a situation like that. It can be tough for the business because obviously they're not, obligated to keep rowdy, drunk people who are vomiting inside. Like that's fair that they don't want them there. But it is an unfortunate situation that things like this happen. And look, Miles, I mean, you and I have worked on a lot of different projects besides True Crime Unsolved, and I can't tell you how many of those have been murders where friends have left another friend and somebody comes along later and takes advantage of that situation. And then on this channel, what we see more often is that leading to a disappearance or an unsolved situation, which may very well have been a murder or something else. Accidents befall people and there's no one around to help too. That's another way this can go. So I think you're right. It seems like, week after week, we do seem to run into stories where this happens. And yeah, I don't know what to do about it. Some sort of a PSA seems necessary, right?
Yeah, don't leave your friends. Unfortunately, looking at the demographics of our audience, it's probably not the people that we need to tell this.
Right.
The people who are watching this already know better. But
Yeah.
kids need to know this. And when I say kids, it's like anyone under 30, right?
Yeah.
Don't leave your friends alone, no matter how much of a pain in the ass they're being, right?
Yeah.
Um, Look, let's talk about what could happen here. And I think it's the same thing that we've seen in other cases. The only thing that's going to solve this is that if someone saw something that night and didn't realize that what they saw was important, right? And then, kind of like with Chance Engelbert, when those girls, came forward years later and were like, "Oh, I came back to town, I saw that billboard, and I didn't realize that that was the night that I saw that truck parked on the street," right?
Mhm.
So maybe someone saw something they didn't realize it mattered and they see this or they see something else and they realize that maybe they should report it. Maybe someone has knowledge of it and they get arrested and there's a way for them to kind of like gain favor with authorities and maybe lessen the sentence that they're facing by telling about what they know about this. Or maybe someone, is bragging and has ends up telling the wrong person, and that person actually has a conscience and, comes forward and tells the authorities what happened.
I think you're right. I think this is a scenario where I really truly believe somebody knows what happened to her. Whether it's more than one person at this point in time is impossible to say, but it's pretty difficult to disappear somebody, forever. I mean, you have to imagine somebody saw something weird that night, maybe, or the next day. Someone's going to find a belonging. Someone may even find Kirsten, we don't know. At the very least, it's possible that somebody involved will say something, like you said, at some point in the future, whether that's tomorrow or years from now. It's really hard to know. But I do hate to admit, with the evidence that we have before us here, it's pretty tough to know where to go, until like something like that comes forward, some sort of revelatory tip or confession. Because right now it just looks like a total mystery to me. A mystery up to the point where I'm pretty sure somebody harmed her that night. But beyond that, I can't really say what happened.
I just have to say that the sheer amount of the number of cases where there's no trace, where people just completely disappear, and we're not talking about transients or folks who are trying to cross the border, and we're talking about just like people who are just walking home from work or walking home from a bar. We're out for a night, we're on vacation, whatever it is, and then they're just gone. I mean, it's staggering. It's staggering. And the more of these we do, the more just blown away I am by just how many people have just gone missing without a trace. There's nothing left behind. It's mind blowing.
It is mind blowing, and especially these cases where they're on camera minutes beforehand. It's just we feel like we live in this age where everything is traceable, everything leaves evidence behind, and in a lot of ways that's true. And it actually just makes it more terrifying when people vanish into thin air because we feel like we should have receipts. Everywhere you go, you feel like you're being photographed, videoed, tracked, recorded. I mean, like we all feel that way, I'm sure, at this point in 2026. So for someone to just go missing like into thin air in the middle of a town, right? It's not like she went missing in the woods. She's in a city. Very unsettling. Very unsettling.
Yeah. Well, listen, guys, let us know what you think. I'm sure you guys are going to have thoughts about this one. So, drop us a comment. We'll be watching the comments, jumping in there, giving you guys replies, and then we'll probably do a comment react to this vid next Monday. So jump in, let us know what you think. As always, guys, if you like what we're doing here, think about subscribing, hit the notifications bell. If you really, really like what we're doing, get a membership. It really, really helps keep us, it really, really helps us keep doing what we're doing. Also, remember, we are also an audio podcast now, so you can find us wherever you find your podcast. That's Apple, Amazon, Spotify, anywhere where you find the other usual suspects. We're there. Just look for True Crime Unsolved. Our whole library is up there, except for our comment reacts, which we keep to YouTube. Sean, anything else?
I think that's it. Well, we're excited to see what you guys think. And don't forget, next Friday, stay tuned for a much deeper look at this case with Kirsten's parents. Until then, we'll see you guys in the comments.
Thanks, everybody.